Okay, so this lesson is about how waterways, so rivers, lakes, can get polluted. And what we're going to look at is how things like fertilizers or being washed into the rivers from the fields, or sewage not being treated properly can get into the water and cause the death of aquatic life. We'll also be producing a kind of graph which is called a kite diagram. So first off, how the pollution gets into the water. So the common pollutants are untreated sewage, fertilizers which have been added to fields, and then when the rain comes it gets washed into the waterways. So just like a gardener would put fertilizer or manure onto their ground to try and encourage the growth of plants, this fertilizer, the sewage, encourages the growth of microscopic algae, which are tiny little plants within the waterways. So those are the common pollutants, and what happens, we end up with what's called an algal bloom. So we have vast numbers of algae building up, and they block the light from reaching the other plants which are in the river as well. So here's just a couple of images of algal blooms, so you can see not much light could get through that, and everything underneath it would die. So also the algae themselves, they have a very short life cycle, so they die as well. And when things die, they rot. And the bacteria and some fungi, which will be living in the river, will break down the bodies of the algae, the bodies of the other plants within there. And as they are breaking them down, they are respiring the tissues and releasing the energy from them, but of course they're doing aerobic respiration, and this uses up the oxygen in the water. The low levels of oxygen then cause all of the other animals that are living in the water to die. So that is how it all works. What I would like you to do is to produce a diagram which summarizes that and base it on something like this. So you have the fertilizer getting into the water, you have the growth of the algae, you'll have the other plants dying, you'll have bacteria using up the oxygen, and you'll finish it off with the death of the fish there. Right, what I recommend is that you pause this film now, complete the diagram, and then start it again, and the next part of the lesson is about completing the kite diagram. So for the kite diagram you will need to access your iBook, and what we see is that in rivers and streams we get different animals depending on how much pollution there is. So we have things like the rat-tailed maggot, which as you can see has a great adaptation for getting oxygen from the air, so it uses this like a snorkel. We have the bloodworm, which has lots of hemoglobin, so it's really good at getting what oxygen there is there. So these can survive when there's lots of pollution. However, animals like the stonefly larvae and the mayfly larvae require very high levels of oxygen, so if you find them, that means that your stream or river or whatever is very unpolluted. Okay, so this is based on what happened in Cardiff Bay. You might be a bit young to remember what life was like before the Cardiff Bay, but when you come into Wales from the M4, just before you get to Newport, you have all of that area on your left-hand side, which is basically mudflats, and that's what Cardiff Bay was like before it was developed. So what they did, they've obviously built the barrage and flooded it with fresh water, so we had a massive lake there. However, there were so many bacteria living in the lake because of the sewage that was getting into it as well, and they used up all of the oxygen, and the posh word that we use for this is eutrophication, but you need to be able to explain why the pollution causes the low levels of oxygen. So they tried several treatments. First of all, they diverted and started treating the sewage, thankfully. They then did a rather crazy thing, which was when nobody was looking and the tides were right, they would just empty the water in the bay out to sea by opening up the barrage. But of course any life that was adapted to living in fresh water would have been killed in the seawater there. They dredged the lake then to remove the mud where lots of bacteria were living, and the final solution, which is what they're still doing nowadays, is they're pumping air through it. If you're up on the link road and you look down, you can see the areas where the bubbles of air are coming up. So first thing I'd like you to do is to just make a flow chart, so put in order the various steps that they did to manage the ecology of the bay. And then it's to produce something called a kite diagram from the data that we have here. And this is my kite diagram here. So if I move it around a little bit more. Okay, so right, so what I want you to do on this is you put the different treatments down the side. It's better to have graph paper, but it's not essential. So I've got my different species, my indicated species. I've just done 2 of them so far, but you've got all of them, and they refer to the animals that you've got here. Right, so we can see when there was no treatment, there were 8 of these found. So I've done 8, and what I've done is I've taken this central line and I've counted 4 either side of it and just drawn a bar there. Diverted sewage, it was down to 6. I've gone 3 either side there, etc., etc., like that. There's no data for the oxygen pumps, so what you need to do is use a dotted line and follow the trend to predict what would happen. So you'll do that for all of the species, and you will see why it's called a kite diagram, because often they're just triangular like a traditional type kite there. So what I want you to do then is just to basically summarise what you've said. Has it worked? And I think the answer is yes, because we're seeing less of these species which can only live in very polluted waters, and we're seeing more and more of the species that can live in clean water there. Okay, so that's what I want you to do, is to complete that. So 2 things: you've got your visual description of how eutrophication works, and you will have your kite diagram of the different species, and it will also, you'll have a written conclusion to explain what the evidence that the different treatments are working. Okay, and then next time I will be setting you just some questions on ecology in general.